before sunrise in the Caribbean. U.S. forces climbed onto an oil tanker and took it. No court ruling, no announcement, just control. This was not a rescue. It was a seizure. In just a few weeks, the United States has taken multiple oil tankers linked to Venezuela, ships accused of carrying sanctioned oil, ships described as part of a ghost fleet. Pause here, because sanctions usually don't look like this. Sanctions are documents, bank rules, legal language. This was steel, helicopters, and armed boarding teams. And the timing matters. As this tanker was seized, President Donald Trump was preparing to meet U.S. oil executives. The topic: investing in Venezuela's oil infrastructure. At the same moment, the U.S. was asserting control over Venezuelan oil itself. That contradiction is not accidental. It is the story. If this feels larger than one ship, trust that instinct. Because to understand this moment, we must first understand what pushed Washington to act this way. Let me be clear about what is happening. This is not an isolated enforcement action. This is a pattern. In recent weeks, the United States has seized tanker after tanker linked to Venezuela. The Olina, the Sofia, the Bella Uno, different ships, different flags, same destination, Venezuelan oil. U.S. officials describe these vessels as part of a ghost fleet. Ships accused of hiding ownership, changing names, changing flags, trying to move oil that is under U.S. sanctions. But notice the shift. Washington is no longer just tracking these ships. It is stopping them, boarding them, redirecting them. At the same time, the White House is talking about something even bigger: sweeping control over Venezuelan crude exports. Not temporarily, but indefinitely. That word matters, because this is no longer just about punishing violations. It is about who controls the flow of oil itself. And to understand why this matters so much now, we have to go back to how Venezuelan oil became a global pressure point in the first place. To understand this moment, we have to rewind. Not years, decades. Venezuela is not a small energy player. It sits on some of the world's largest proven oil reserves. For years, that oil shaped its economy and its politics. When sanctions were imposed, the goal was pressure, economic pressure, political pressure. But oil does not disappear. It looks for routes, for buyers, for workarounds. That is how shadow systems emerge. Ships that change names, ships that switch flags, ships that move quietly, far from headlines. This is not unique to Venezuela, but Venezuela became a test case, because when oil markets tighten, enforcement hardens. Tracking becomes chasing. Chasing becomes interception. And now, the U.S. military is no longer watching from satellites alone. It is physically present, on decks, at sea. This is the historical shift from sanctions as rules to sanctions as force. And once that line is crossed, something fundamental changes. Because enforcement no longer depends on compliance, it depends on power. That brings us to the first real rupture. The moment when this strategy stopped being theoretical, the rupture came quietly. At sea, before sunrise, the tanker Olina was moving through the Caribbean, suspected, tracked, watched. Then it was boarded. U.S. Coast Guard forces, Marines from Joint Task Force Southern Spear. They climbed onto the ship and took control. This was not a warning. It was an apprehension. U.S. officials called the Olina a ghost fleet tanker, a ship accused of carrying embargoed Venezuelan oil, a vessel allegedly trying to evade U.S. forces. And this was not the first, it was the fifth. That number changes everything. Because one seizure can be explained, 5 cannot. It signals a new threshold, a moment when enforcement becomes routine. Homeland Security officials were blunt. These ships will not outrun justice, they said. They will not hide under false claims of nationality. This was not just about oil. It was about message. If you move sanctioned crude, the ocean is no longer neutral. And once that message is sent, escalation becomes structural, not emotional, not accidental, because now the system demands repetition. And that leads us to the deeper question. What system is actually being enforced here? Look beneath the seizures, and you see a system at work, not chaos, design. Sanctions alone cannot stop oil. Oil flows unless it is physically blocked. That is the uncomfortable truth. So the strategy shifts from paperwork to presence, from regulation to control. The term ghost fleet matters here. It is not just descriptive, it is political. Once a ship is labeled a ghost, it loses legitimacy. Its flag is questioned. Its protection weakens. Intervention becomes justified. This is how legal ambiguity becomes operational space. At the same time, Washington is signaling something even larger: control over Venezuelan oil sales. Not for weeks, not for months, but indefinitely. That word keeps returning. Indefinitely. This is no longer about stopping bad actors. It is about managing supply. Who sells, who buys, who moves oil, and under whose authority. And when energy becomes administrated by force, markets adjust, alliances shift, and risk spreads outward. Because the sea is not just a route, it is a system, and systems react. That reaction is already visible. In another seizure, in another flag, in another power watching closely, the second surge came fast, and it came far from Venezuela. In the North Atlantic, U.S. forces intercepted another tanker, the Bella Uno, a ship flying a Russian flag. It had been tracked for weeks, followed, chased. When it was finally seized, the implications widened instantly. This was no longer just about Venezuela. This was about reach. The Bella One changed its name, changed its registration, re-emerged as the Marinera, still moving oil, still under suspicion. 2 Russian nationals were on board. Their detention triggered a response from Moscow. The Kremlin publicly thanked President Trump after they were released. That matters, because oil enforcement had now crossed into diplomacy, and diplomacy had crossed into energy warfare. Another tanker followed, the Sophia, seized in international waters near the Caribbean, escorted toward the United States. Different oceans, same method. This is escalation by repetition. Each seizure lowers the political cost of the next one. Each action normalizes the last. And when enforcement becomes routine, it stops being exceptional. It becomes policy, which brings this story closer to you than you might think. Because when global energy systems tighten, the pressure does not stay at sea. Now bring this closer to you, because when oil is seized at sea, the impact does not stay there. You may never see the tanker. You may never hear its name. But you feel the consequences. When supply is controlled, uncertainty rises. When uncertainty rises, systems tighten. Companies hesitate. Governments recalculate. And in moments like this, ordinary people carry the weight. You live inside systems you did not design. Energy systems, trade systems, geopolitical systems. When power replaces rules, stability becomes fragile. You sense it as tension, as unpredictability, as the feeling that decisions are being made far away by forces you cannot influence. That is why this matters. Not because of Venezuela alone, not because of one administration, but because this is what it feels like when global control shifts quietly. If you want to keep understanding how these hidden decisions shape your world, this is the moment to stay engaged, to keep watching, to keep asking questions, because the story does not end with one country or one ocean. It spreads, zoom out now, far beyond the Caribbean, because when a superpower asserts control over oil flows, the world notices. Every seizure sends a signal to producers, to traders, to governments watching quietly. International waters are meant to be neutral, but neutrality weakens when enforcement expands. When ships are stopped not by courts, but by force. Energy routes are global arteries. When one is squeezed, pressure shifts elsewhere. Other exporters adjust. Other fleets adapt. Other powers calculate their exposure. Flags change faster. Routes grow longer. Insurance costs rise. Risk spreads. And rivals pay attention, because today it is Venezuelan oil. Tomorrow it could be something else. This is how energy becomes geopolitics in motion. Not speeches, not summits, but actions repeated until they redefine norms. The sea, once a shared space, becomes a contested one. And when that happens, miscalculation becomes more likely. Tension becomes structural. History shows us this pattern clearly. Control over resources reshapes alliances and fractures them, which leads to the final question. Where does this path go next? From here, the future splits, not into certainties, but into paths. The first path is controlled stability. The United States maintains firm oversight of Venezuelan oil. Seizures continue. Flows are managed. Markets adapt. In this scenario, enforcement becomes predictable. Risk is priced in. Tension exists, but it is contained. Power is visible, and that visibility deters defiance. The second path is prolonged ambiguity. Control is asserted, but rules remain unclear. Who decides? How long does it last? What counts as compliance? In this world, uncertainty dominates. Seizures feel selective. Trust erodes. Every ship becomes a question mark. And then there is the third path, escalation. More actors become involved. More flags are challenged. More detentions trigger diplomatic responses. At that point, oil is no longer just leverage. It becomes friction. History tells us something important here. Systems under pressure do not break loudly at first. They bend, they creak, they test limits, and the choices made now quietly at sea will determine which path hardens into reality. Because control, once exercised, is rarely surrendered without consequence. That brings us to the end and to the question that matters most. What we are watching is not just enforcement. It is a redefinition. For decades, power over oil meant influence. Now it means custody. Who holds it? Who releases it? Who decides when? The seizure of tankers is not the headline. It is the signal, a signal that energy is no longer governed only by markets or law, but by presence and force. This moment will be studied later, not as an episode, but as a turning point, because once control becomes normalized, the world adjusts its behavior around it. If you want to understand the future of energy, of geopolitics, of how invisible decisions shape your daily life, this is where you start paying attention. Stay with these stories. Question them, share them, because the next video will not begin at sea. It will begin with the consequences of what happens after. And in a world where power moves quietly, awareness is no longer optional.